It's my privilege today to welcome our guest speaker. A few years ago, as I first came into Mustang, there was an election getting ready to take place. And in the midst of that election, and I guess the campaign, we might say, I had an opportunity to get acquainted with the Honorable State Senator Steve Russell. And but since that time, I've had opportunity to hear and to visit with him and get acquainted with him, and I've been very impressed with not just his ability as a speaker, his desire to serve in the community and to be a part of state government, but what I've been most impressed with is his desire to express his love for his Christ. And so I believe that you're going to enjoy, but you're going to be challenged by the words that Senator Russell presents today. He served in the U.S. Army. He's a retired lieutenant colonel. He was involved in leading the platoon, and he'll tell us some about it, but the group that captured Saddam Hussein. He has a book out in the foyer that tells about that experience. It's a $30 book. With tax, it'll be added to that. But if you like that kind of stuff, you will enjoy his book. But you also need to know it's a limited edition book. It's a first edition book. And there's another printing coming out in December. But this book that he has there has more pictures than the new edition will have. And so that's out there and it's available to you. But most importantly, as I said, what's impressed me the most is his love for his God and his desires. So Senator Russell, come, and we're glad to have you today. Let's welcome Senator Steve Russell. Thank you, Steve.
Well, good morning. How's everybody? It's always a privilege to come and see our veterans honored, and even more important, just together with the strength of believers. Everywhere I go, in the last week, I've been in Florida and Tennessee and Texas, and next week I'll be in Mississippi. When Terry had asked me to come, I said, well, we'll put a date on there and we'll see what happens. And I'm thankful that I was able to stick around home here this weekend as we see our veterans honored. Well, I appreciate the welcome. Mustang is home territory, and I know many of you that are out there. And when I was a boy growing up in Del City, I never thought that I would stand here as a soldier having participated in a major historic event. And I certainly never thought that I would be a featured speaker traveling across the country talking about it. I'm humbled by it all. And I'm mindful of Proverbs 21:21, where it says, "He that follows righteousness and mercy finds life, righteousness, and honor." And I recognize that I am a blessed man. And while major events in my life may have been unpredictable, many that knew me in my youth would not be surprised that I became a soldier. As a child, no flower bed was safe from a vast invasion of toy soldiers, or the front yards we were subjected to foxhole digging for our G.I. Joes and all of those things. The grown-ups in my neighborhood, most of them World War II veterans. They fascinated me with tales of what it was like to fight in a tank in North Africa, or what it was like to assault Japanese-held Pacific islands, or what it was like to live under Nazi occupation in France. And while their stories each varied, they all shared a common love for the United States of America, born of their trials and sacrifices. Unknown to me then, God was preparing my own heart and my own future service through these adults. And I can relate to the psalmist David when he said, "He teaches my hands to make war, that a bow may be broken by my arms." Well, my fascination with the military was not my only desire of my heart and my youth. My parents had raised me to always be truthful And 5 generations of living family taught me the importance of people and that they matter. One of the most powerful influences in my life was my great-grandfather, and he and his 3 brothers were World War I veterans. He had seen so much in his lifetime. He lived well into his 90s, and we became very close. And while I was raised to believe in God, I did not discover a personal relationship with him until my teenage years. My grandmother, Vesta Russell, and because here in Oklahoma you have grandmothers named Vesta who marry people named Elman and have sons named Clyde, which is my dad. Well, she was a God-fearing woman. She never learned to drive. My grandfather did not know the Lord. I had the privilege to lead him to Christ when he was 80 years of age, and I'm very thankful for that. And he lived 4 more wonderful years reconciling to his whole family during that time. But at this time, she prayed faithfully for all of us, and she felt like I should go to church. And so she arranged with a neighbor to take me one Sunday morning. So at the age of 12, for the first time, at a small church in Midwest City, I heard about Jesus Christ and the fact that he had died on the cross to pay for my sins. And I was deeply moved by it all. It didn't necessarily make me a Christian, but I became moved by the story. And after about 6 months, I decided, after visiting that church, I decided to visit other churches. And I visited every type of church that was out there, all the different denominations and different things. But after a time, in my 13-year-old brain, I thought, well, they all can't be right. And each one seemed to lay some special claim to the truth. And so in my 13-year-old logic, I said, I'm just not going to go anymore. And so my pursuit of God stopped at the ripe old age of 13. But God's pursuit of me never did stop. And one particular day, while playing in the woods of Crutchow Creek, when you could play in the woods in Crutchow Creek, I suffered the inevitable consequences of using poison ivy as a part of my personal camouflage. And I was extremely itchy, puffed up, looking like the Michelin tire man, and laying on the bed out of school, alone in the house. I loved to read, and there was nothing available to read within reach except for the one Bible in our home. It was a wedding gift to my parents from 1955. For some reason, it was laying on the headboard of my bed. And so I grabbed it and blew the dust off of it, opened it up, and began to read in Matthew. And after I got through the begats, I got to the Sermon on the Mount. And I was moved deeply by the words of Christ as he instructed people in how they could conduct their lives and how they should treat others and how they should live and pursue God. And so that day I prayed to God. I said, Lord, there's got to be a way a person can find life like this. Still not a Christian, but having a deep appreciation that there were some good things in the Word of God. Well, thank God for the Gideons. Healed from my bout with, one of my many bouts with poison ivy, I went back to school, and in that day you could grab New Testaments out of racks right in the hallways of the school. And so I grabbed a little black Gideon's New Testament, and I began to read it. And I was deeply moved by all of that. And I learned several things from it as I read through the Scriptures. I learned that I was a sinner. That's why I'd feel guilty when I did things wrong. I also learned that if I died in that condition as a sinner, that I would be eternally separated from God forever. But that if I confessed with my mouth and believed in my heart that God had raised Christ from the dead, that if I would just confess that he would not only forgive my sins, but he would restore my relationship to God as he intended. And I also learned in Ephesians and Philippians that even if I came to Christ by believing in him, that I would still struggle in this body of flesh as a human being. But to take courage, because the same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead was also available to me to call upon when I struggled in life on a daily basis. Well, not looking back and having become a Christian by reading the Bible and having prayed the sinner's prayer that was in the back of that Gideon's New Testament, I began to pursue so many things in God's Word. And I fell in love with the book of Proverbs. For the longest time, thought they were part of the New Testament because they were right there in that little black one. And loved the Psalms and became where I just really enjoyed the Scriptures. And a year later, having come to faith in Christ by reading the Bible, I was still wary of churches and invitations to come. But several girls, it's always that way, isn't it, guys? They began to pray and pressure that I would come and visit church, and being the tough guy that I was, I completely gave in, and I went. And as I went into First Southern Baptist Church in Del City, Oklahoma, which is, was always there when I was growing up, and I used to make fun of that church because they were buying up everything. I said they were going to buy my home next or something like that. But as I came through those doors, a skinny 15-year-old kid with shoulder-length hair parted down the middle, I know it's hard to imagine. There were men in that church that loved on me and prayed with me and took me aside and mentored me and gave me the spiritual growth and counsel that my own parents were not providing, as they were not Christians. And so the next time that teenage punk walks through the doors of your church, men, take the time. You don't know what that young man or that young lady might become in God's hands someday. Well, in school, my desire to serve Christ and others found great opportunity. My good academic marks allowed me to earn a full 4-year Army scholarship. And after graduation from Del City High, I went off to Ouachita Baptist University in Arkadelphia, Arkansas. I'll say that 4 times fast. And God continued to bless my life. I met my wonderful wife, Cindy, there. We've been married 26 years come December, and we have 5 wonderful children. And in 1985, I received a commission in the United States Army. In college, to show you God's sense of humor, I majored in public speaking, thinking they'll give you a degree for talking, sign me up. Not realizing that someday it would come in very, very handy. Well, I served my country for 21 years, not because I was underprivileged, or because I was somehow less educated, or because I was from Oklahoma and I couldn't get a decent job. Rather, I served because of conviction of love of country and the American way of life, even when at times some have been unkind in their conviction about our service in these current wars. I believe that my service was a calling that God blessed. And little did we realize that when we embarked from Fort Hood, Texas in the spring of 2003, that our division would bring a dictator to justice, and that the great soldiers that I would have the privilege to command in the 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry would play a significant role in that. Now, many people imagine that the Saddam capture was the result of some lofty intelligence handed down, or from CIA operatives who sleuthed it, or from satellites that pinpointed his location and says, look, there he is, go get him. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. It was the result of 6 months of very hard work on the part of just regular soldiers working hand in hand with a special operations team, actually 2 teams that we worked with over a 6-month period. One particular day in early June of 2003, as we were trying to keep control of the city of Tikrit after having fought vehicle on vehicle, army on army, marked uniform and marked equipment against marked uniform and marked equipment, we now found ourselves given orders to occupy the city of Tikrit, Iraq, which was Saddam's hometown. And while I never imagined that we would be involved in the hunt for Saddam, for us it really became geography. That's where we were, and that's how we became involved. There were 2 businessmen that came and said, Mister, I have some information. There were always people that came to you and said they had information. And on this particular day, I reluctantly decided to listen to them. I said, all right, bring them in. And we were hot, we were tired, we had been trying to do a lot of different things. But these 2 businessmen came in, and they began to describe for us how Saddam's security apparatus operated before he was removed from power. And they said it centered around really 3 groups. You had a group of 25 of bodyguards. They were bodyguards 24 hours a day. They would work in shifts, but this group of people was always around Saddam. And consequently, this group was called the 25. Pretty clever. They also had a second group, which was about 40 individuals, and they were bodyguards in every sense of the word, except they would do functional roles like cook, driver, gardener, mechanic, whatever it might be. In the immediate needs that Saddam and his family and his household would have, they would also form this tight network of bodyguards around him. And these individuals were very, very close to Saddam. Many of them blood relatives. All of them close associates of those that had been connected with Saddam since the 1950s. And then he had another group. This group of 40, by the way, was called the 40. And then you had groups of special security officers that would go out, and they were recruited among these families of these guys and distant cousins and relatives or close associates of Saddam, and they numbered in the hundreds. And they would go anywhere Saddam went. If he was traveling, say, from Baghdad to Tikrit or wherever, there might be 3 different possible routes. They would go in advance, go to intersections, go to overpasses, anywhere there might be opportunity for ambush or that Saddam could be put into jeopardy, they would be there in advance. And so taking this information at the time, I remember listening to it as they unfolded it all, with details and names of these about a half a dozen families that were associated with Saddam is where all of this group really came from, these half dozen families, much like a mafia don. And I remember listening to it at the time. I thought, this is the most organized lie I've ever heard, or there's got to be some truth to it. And so taking this information, we developed a strategy. Much like kicking the legs out from under a chair, we felt that if we kicked the supports around Saddam out from under him, it might lead to his location. And while they were very good at protecting Saddam, they were not so good at protecting themselves. They were mean people. People knew them, and they feared them. As they traveled around in town, they would be visible. And so we developed a tiered strategy to go after these bodyguards and these mid-level organizers, and then also the street fighters in many cases, which would be their sons and nephews and others that were fighting us in this new insurgency. Well, early successes only confirmed that this type of strategy of going after these guys would work. In June, working with a special operations team in Saddam's birth village of Ojah, which sat just to the south of Tikrit, we captured this guy, Abid Hamid Mahmoud al-Khattab. He was a pretty important guy. He would be like our White House chief of staff. He was so important that he was the ace of diamonds on the deck of cards. Do you remember the deck of cards? Well, you had Saddam and his 2 sons that were 3 of the 4 aces, and this guy. So apart from Saddam and his sons, the most wanted man in Iraq. And we captured him in a surprise raid in early or mid-June of 2003, working with a special operations forces team led by a guy I'll call Jack. And we were thrilled, and soon the press took great note of this capture, and it was a clear sign that not only was Saddam in the area, but it was possible to get people as important as that. And as a result of this raid, we also received whereabouts of Saddam himself, information from local Iraqis. And they gave us a tip and said that Saddam was hiding at a place known as the Hadoshi farm. Now, the Hadoshis were one of these families around Saddam. And as we took that information, we put together a very quick raid and raided this distinct farm on the bank of the Tigris River that night. And although we narrowly missed Saddam, in fact, we think he could have been hiding there, much like he was caught later. And while we did miss him, we did get some important things. We got Mrs. Hussein's passport and her national identity card. Many of the Saddam family papers, like you would have in your own home, your important papers that you keep in a box or whatever it might be. We got those things. And we got probably, like what you ladies travel with, over $2 million worth of jewels in bank boxes. Each individual piece, 40 to 60 carats worth of gems, unbelievable wealth. And then we also got, when the house is on fire, what do you grab? The pictures, right? The guys are saying, no, the guns. What are you talking about? Well, we got the Saddam family photo albums. We had these very intimate portraits, of, just like you have, of your own family picture albums of birthday parties of little Uday and Kusay. How sweet. Saddam at the beach. I apologize. Many of you intended to eat lunch this afternoon, and I've spoiled it for you. But the most amazing thing that we got that day, apart from the photo albums, which are now at the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, Georgia, was this. $8.5 million in United States currency, and $750,000 in foreign currency that you see behind me in the gym bag. And if that weren't enough, one of Saddam's cousins the next morning after this raid tried to flee the area with $850,000 more US dollars in a gym bag, and we caught him. So if you ever wanted to know what it was like to sit on $10 million, there it is. Quite a thrill. Now, many people have asked, they said, what did you guys do with all of that money? Retirement has been wonderful. It's been, that's a joke. We were pretty much terrified of all of that wealth. Each stack was $100,000. Each short stack was $10,000. Each individual bill was a $100 bill. The real stuff, Chase Manhattan bank wrappers. And so my top soldier, Command Sergeant Major Pete Martinez, he got a tough box like you get at Walmart and throw in the back of your pickup truck, and it had a hasp on each side. So he put a lock on one side and wore the key around his neck, and I put a lock on the other side and wore the key around my neck. So like a nuclear secret, we both had to be there with the keys to open it up. And then I posted Sergeant First Class Milton Benson on the box. Now, Sergeant First Class Milton Benson was a huge guy. He could bench press, well, like this church. He was a big guy. And I said, Sergeant Benson, every time somebody gets into the box, you have to account for every single bill. And so you can imagine how many curiosity seekers got turned away by Sergeant Benson. Now, not long back, I was speaking up in New York, and I had to explain a few things. Walmart, tough box, and pickup truck, but they finally got the idea. Well, this raid confirmed that the strategy that we had developed was indeed working, and that Saddam's henchmen could not only be found, but they could put us very close to the trail of Saddam himself. And in the months that followed, though, the enemy did not sit idle. Whereas before we were fighting force on force, enemy on enemy, in marked equipment and marked uniforms, we were still abiding by those rules of land warfare, which we as Americans have always abided by. But they would not. They began to blend into the population. Imagine 3 enemies sitting among you, dressed just like you and looking just like you. How do you pick them out? Very difficult. And our soldiers became discouraged with some of that because they did not want to take innocent life amongst these enemy. But I told my soldiers, look, we will not be the hunted. We will be the hunters. And I said, the good news is, last time I checked, even though we're infantrymen, we're still human beings. And the enemy's human beings. They think like human beings, so do we. We'll figure it out. And if we were going to kill us, where would we go? Well, let's get there first, and let's kill them instead. And so I taught our soldiers the art of the ambush, and we began to exact a heavy toll on the enemy with these types of tactics. And I told my soldiers, I said, look, if God intends for me to die in Iraq, it's going to happen. There's not a thing I can do about it. But if he does not intend for me to die in Iraq, there's nothing the enemy can do to make that so. And I could lead from the front and lead my soldiers because of my faith in Jesus Christ. It didn't take away the fear, and it certainly didn't take away the stress of battle, but it did take away the anxiety of wondering what would happen to me should I die in combat. Tactically, operationally, we were winning. Our soldiers seized the initiative, and we began to refine our intelligence. And as a result of that, and taking on these guys, the big guys protecting Saddam and the street fighters that were trying to also disrupt our operations, the Iraqis reluctantly and sometimes cautiously would bring us information. And we got an incredible tip as to the whereabouts of this man. Let's see, get it up there. Once you see him, it's amazing how many pictures he turns up. He's kind of like Elmo. He's always there. You know, you look at him in the back of the... his name was Adnan Abid al-Muslit. And what made him so special was that he was Saddam's #1 personal bodyguard. If Saddam only took one bodyguard on any place that he went or did, this was the guy that was with him. He had served him faithfully for 20 years. He was a very tough guy, big guy. Well, we got a tip as to his location, and we put together a raid in about 45 minutes, surrounded his location. Our soldiers got to him. He put up a fight, and fortunately, he did not make it to his weapon he had by his bedside as they came through. And so he struggled with our soldiers, and a big fight ensued, and they drug him down a flight of stairs. And here you see him as a guest of a couple of my soldiers. And that's how he got the bump on his head when he came down the stairs there. But he was one of the most important catches at the time, because it really gave the Iraqis confidence that we were getting close to getting around Saddam. And soon the press, as a result of these and other raids, they began to descend on our task force. At times I would have 30 to 40 print and camera media and photographers in my task force, which was, something interesting to deal with, that many media folks that are following you around as you're trying to fight a war. And so what we saw was that with these successes, that the enemy was certainly not going to sit idle. They began to push back on us and introduce the roadside bombs in large numbers, which were devastating to our soldiers. They also would target any civilians that were working with us. Government officials they would assassinate, chiefs of police or skilled workers, people that ran the public works would become targets as they tried to wrest control and try to fight against us in the area of Tikrit. But even with all of this, we continued our pursuit of Saddam, and we successfully countered the insurgents fighting us in these daily street battles. And while we did lose soldiers in these fights, each raid, each success that we had got us one step closer because of the information that we captured, the people that we interrogated, the photographs that we now possessed, where we could kind of, almost like police detective work, put together who these people were among the family and go after them. And so while we did suffer some setbacks, we also saw the Iraqi people begin to cooperate even more. And we took advantage of that. We began to work with the sheikhs and the local government leaders. We began to work with those that were involved in government and tried to put together training for their police and for their soldiers and help them as they began to have their first elections and their first votes. I tried to convey to the press at the time, when I do this, just click it. How about that? Because it's not reaching. There we go. All right, thanks. I tried to convey to the press that the losses that we suffered, while indeed tragic, they in no way lessened our ability to accomplish the mission. One of the mysteries to me is how the media would only report our losses. They would never report the successes that we had on the battlefield as soldiers. And they seem to forget that we knew these soldiers that we served with. We knew their laughter, we knew their stories, we knew their passions, their dreams of the future. And it's not like we didn't have a heart for them. In fact, we felt the losses greater than anybody back here or anywhere else. And so I tried to convey to the press that we were not going to quit, not unless our nation ordered us home, or we lost every single soldier in the attempt, which was not likely to happen. To the media's credit, they covered our aggressive operations well, even if at times they questioned our tactics. And one of the most controversial tactics that we employed was when we surrounded Saddam's birth village of Oja with barbed wire fence. We were sick of this town. We had been in already 40% of the dwellings in that village of 3,500 people. And so I asked my staff one day, I said, how much would it take to completely surround the town with barbed wire And they laughed and they said, "Well, that's a good one, sir." And I said, "No, I'm dead serious. How much would it take?" It was a lot. It was miles of barbed wire. And so on Halloween night in 2003, we did just that. And the whole village woke up to being completely fenced into their own town. They couldn't go or leave except through a single entryway. And if they were 14-year-old male or older, they had to submit to a search. They were issued a photo ID, and they also were subject to a census there in the town. I got the idea from the French. In the 1950s, the French used these tactics with great success in Algeria. In the city of Algiers, they had these tight, packed, close-quartered areas known as the Kasbahs, where you just had teeming population, innocent people, most of them, but the enemy would hide in there. And so I reasoned at the time that if the enemy stayed in this village, we would catch them outright. If they fled, well, then we could get them by intercepting their cell phone, or they would go out to wife number 2, number 3, number 4, to a less protected farm or area, and they would become much more visible. Well, the impact of this operation was tremendous, and Saddam's key players among these half a dozen controlling families became very visible. And the information began to snowball. The most prominent family protecting Saddam was the Muslit family, of which Saddam's number 1 bodyguard had come from. But the main line that we were looking for, that family had 10 brothers. Can you imagine? Multi-wife culture. So there were an infinite number of places for these guys to hide. Well, we had captured a couple of these brothers, and other units had captured a couple of more. And I could feel the momentum building in November when my wife, Cindy, she wrote to me, and she said that a man named Dick Dwinell was trying to get a message to me. I was like, okay, I don't know Dick Dwinell, but send it on. And so he sent this note to me, and he said, "I've seen you and your troops on television being covered. I know you're involved with the hunt for Saddam." He said, "I've also heard you're a praying man." He said, "If you and your troops will pray and ask for God's help, he'll help you." He said, "God knows where Saddam is. It's just a matter of leading troops to that location." And as I read the note, I'm looking at it and the simplicity of it. But it was hard to deny the truth of what he was saying. Of course God knew where Saddam was. And so I thought, well, what does it hurt? And like, you need an excuse to pray and battle anyway. And so I called on my chaplain and the brigade chaplain, and over the next several weeks, we didn't force anybody, but those that were willing, which was a fair number, we prayed for God's guidance, for his wisdom. And we also prayed that he would help us in our operations. And I prayed personally for sound decision making and for clarity of mind. Well, over the next several weeks, things just really began to unravel. On December 4th, a special operations team led by a guy that I'll call Jack, we did a simultaneous raid on 8 targets, his unit and mine, and we were able to capture some pretty amazing players inside this network of Saddam. And that put us on a very quick turnaround of successive raids over the next week. And then a few days later, a teenage boy, he walks up to a checkpoint where some of the soldiers were there at Tikrit, and he said, "I know where some important people are hiding." We decided to believe him because, for one, he was a boy, and 2, he said, "I know where some important people are." And my commander, Colonel Jim Hickey, which you see here, he talked to the boy personally. And then after we got the information about this area that he was telling us about, this farm, he ordered me to send a company-sized force to this farm in a desert west of Tikrit. This raid amazingly produced relatives of the family that had hidden Saddam in 1959. Now, in that year, he tried to kill the Iraqi prime minister in a failed coup attempt, and this family had hidden him on the bank of the Tigris River near the village of Adwar. And as he tried to escape, the Iraqi security forces got all around him, so he swam the Tigris River, was given a white horse, and rode off to become the tyrant that he became. Little did we know that this same family and this same farm would come into play in the next few days. And as a result of these raids, we also got very important information as to the whereabouts of this man, Mohammed al-Muslit, a virtual unknown when the war began. You remember the last public appearance of Saddam when you had the 3rd Infantry Division of the Army taking Baghdad International Airport, and you had Marines on the other side of the city, and as they closed to get around Baghdad, you had Saddam, and here's a still from the television footage on the 9th of April. He got out in the big public square, and he's standing on a car being the benevolent dictator, and everybody's cheering him. The next time you see that footage, you'll see the guy that was driving him, this guy, get up on the back of the car with a pistol protecting him. That was Mohammed al-Muslit. We had been looking for him since May of 2003 after we found out his importance. Well, as a result of the raids of the previous few days, his location was deduced, and John's special operations team with a couple of other teams scoured 3 different areas, and they ended up getting him on the 12th of December. Colonel Hickey and I were elated because we felt that if this guy were ever captured, he had to know Saddam's exact location, and he did. On December 13th in the morning, I received a call from Colonel Hickey, and he said, "Steve, get all your forces ready. I want everything available. This might be the big one." Now, we had been through the big one many times, but I reasoned that if you do nothing, you get nothing. And while you might drill 100 dry holes, one might be the gusher. And so he ordered me to take my soldiers and quietly pull them out of the city so that we would have the forces available, and they were replaced with military police. But as the day went on, and as Muslit was brought up to be interrogated there in Tikrit, we learned that Saddam's exact location was actually near the village of Ad-Dawar, just across the river. Now here you can see in the city in the upper left as it goes down to the middle of the map there, that's the city of Tikrit. And then in the middle you see Saddam's birth village of Ojah that we surrounded with the barbed wire, and that was where his personal residence was, where his wife lived, and all of that. And then toward the bottom you see the Hadoshi farm where we got the $10 million on the south bank of the Tigris River there. And the location just northeast of that was the farm that we became very interested in on the other bank of the river, straight across from the bluff on the Hadoshi farm. And so we pinpointed it to 2 areas where you had 2 distinct small farm hut areas, an orchard. And so Colonel Hickey adjusted the forces for the operation. John's team, reinforced by 2 other special operations forces teams, would come in to join him from Baghdad. You would have Little Birds and other special ops air assets that would come in. You also had the 42nd Field Artillery that was to the south, which would be the top of the photo there. To the left, you would have the 10th Cavalry. To the right, you would have my battalion, the 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry, and then you'd have the 299th Engineers. And this became the force that surrounded Saddam's supposed location. We knew the intelligence was going to be as good as it ever was, and that if he tried to escape, we would have sufficient force so that he could not get away. At 8 o'clock, all forces were set. Both farms were seized. 2 men tried to flee through the orchard from the location there at the top of the photo, and they ran north toward the bottom of the photo. And what we think that they did is that they hid Saddam, and then they ran in the opposite direction, trying to put the soldiers off from Saddam's location. But a sergeant in Des Bailey's recon troop named John Iverson from Texas, he saw movement in the woods, and he captured these 2 individuals that turned out to be Saddam's cook and his brother who drove for him, part of that inner circle of bodyguards. We didn't know it immediately at the time, but we knew something was up. And so a lot of searching, a lot of waiting, a lot of patience, all soldiers just on high alert, looking, listening for anything that might be going on. John and his men, they began to look through the place, can't find anything. And Des Bailey, who had the recon troop, which was part of Colonel Hickey's 1st Brigade, he talked to John as he came out of this southern farm there at the top of the photo, and he says, "Well, Des, it looks like another dry hole." And Des says, "Well, let's check it one more time." And thank God he did, but the difference this time was that Mohammed al-Muslit had been brought along for the raid. Now, he wasn't too happy about it, but he was sitting in a Humvee, and so John and a couple of his guys, they went out to get him, and they said, look, and a few other things that I won't repeat here. Said, where is he? He says, he's there. Trust me, keep looking. Instead, they grabbed him and they brought him in, and the area where Saddam was not very big. In fact, it would be from about where I am to the flowers there. And all of you would be the wheat field, the choir chairs would be the orchard, and you had a gate that was covered in sheet metal, and then you had growth and everything that concealed in the fence area of this patio, and then you had the 3-room shack that was, say, where I'm standing. And so as they brought Muslet in, you had the cook and the brother that were there, and they were looking at Muslet, surprised to see him, and he was surprised to see the other two, so they're just kind of looking at each other, none of them wanting to say anything. And so they, John's soldiers, there were only probably 5 soldiers and a translator that were physically on site at this time. The translator's name, Samir, he lives in St. Louis today. And they said, where is he? He says, he's here. And so he goes and he motions with his foot towards a foot mat that was near the edge of this patio area. It looked like it belonged there. Very clever disguise. And so as Muslet alerted them to this, they got the other two, put sandbags over their heads. We did that to protect their identity so that if they turned out to be innocent people, you would release them and there would be no repercussions. So they were brought out, bags over their heads, zip-tied, and then Muslet was brought out also in the same condition. And so the soldiers just see a few people coming out, you know, like they always did. And then you had a couple of guys getting ready around this foot mat. They noticed that it had dirt and rope, and as they brushed the dirt away, they saw that the rope was handles to a top. And so they began to pull on the top and saw that it was connected to something. And Muslet had talked about a tunnel or a hiding place or something. It was really unclear, the specific details, didn't know how big it was. And so as they pulled the top off of this, they had a flashbang hand grenade ready to throw down in the hole. It wouldn't have killed anybody. It would have rung their bell, but it wouldn't have killed anybody. And then they had a couple of soldiers ready to deal with whatever's at the bottom. As they pull up the top, they see 2 hands at the bottom. No weapon visible. So they began to shout down in the hole, who are you? Come out, put your hands up. And Samir, he's translating what the special operations soldiers are saying. And from the bottom of the hole, you heard, I am Saddam Hussein, the duly elected president of Iraq, and I'm willing to negotiate. And so one of John's men, he says, well, President Bush sends his regards. And he says, Samir, tell him to put his hands up before he gets himself killed. And so one hand came out, and then another. Is a little bit of confusion. When there was enough of his hands out, and then him, they grabbed him by the collar, the beard, the hair, the scruff of the neck, whatever it was, and pulled him out of the hole. John, at this point, he radios to Colonel Hickey. He said, sir, we may have something. We all perked up. They began to check him for a 3-dot tattoo on the back of his left hand in the crook of the thumb and forefinger. Sunburst tattoo on the back of the right hand. These were marks that we knew that Saddam possessed. And so as they began to try to check him, he got a little uppity and he tried to shove the soldiers away, and that was a stupid thing to do. So they straightened him out, and that's how he got the cut on his brow and the cut lip. After that, he became very cooperative. So he went benign. They checked him. John radioed to Colonel Hickey. He says, jackpot. So we all perked up. The commanders, we knew something was seriously unfolding. Very excited about it. And so they put a bag over Saddam's head, zip-tied him. You didn't want to linger with him and make him a zoo where everybody parades by and looks at him. And so the ex-president was immediately taken out and thrown onto a Little Bird helicopter and flown to the Water Palace in Tikrit. And then Colonel Hickey began to call. He called General Odierno, who was our division commander at the time. Now he's the chief of staff of the Army. And then he called the field commanders. And I got a call on the commander's digital telephone, satellite, point to point. There were no links down. I was the bottom rung. So anytime this thing rang, I knew it was somebody with something important. And why did we use it? Because we have smart soldiers, and they love to hear what commanders talk about on the radio. So I picked up the receiver, and he said simply, Cesar Romero. Now, during the summer, there were what-if pictures of what Saddam might look like in disguise. And some showed him with a beard, not, mustache, not, bald, not, whatever. And one of them looked amazingly like the actor Cesar Romero in one of these digital enhanced photographs. And now, many of you will remember that he played the Joker in the Batman television series in the 1960s. And Colonel Hickey and I amused by this likeness, and so we used the name Cesar Romero as a code name for Saddam, really, from that point. But as he was telling me this, before I could respond, he says, not a word. He said, the president has to be notified, and this is going to take some time. And I said, Roger, sir, I understand the importance of it. He said, tell none of your soldiers what has just happened. And I said, Roger, sir. He said, cut off all communications within your command and await for further instructions. And so we did. I hung up the receiver, and I put on my best straight face, and I had to go find a place to be alone for a moment. And I began to reflect on so many things. The blood, the sweat, the tears that our soldiers had shed, how we had thinned out 60% of Saddam's henchmen, a deck of cards guys, others, how we had captured the Ace of Diamonds, and how we had worked hand in hand with the two Special Operations Forces teams led by Jack and John, the men that we lost, and a couple of women. All of this, and now Saddam himself captured. December 13th, 2003 will always be one of the proudest days of my life, and I thank God for giving us the victory that night. The night that Saddam was caught, there were two soldiers involved that were among the many. There were probably 1,000 soldiers involved with the raid. Among them were Ian Weichel and Mark Payne. Now, Ian, he was part of Des Bailey's reconnaissance troop. He was the executive officer, and he was actually in the orchard looking for the guys that were on the run. There you see him in the hole, which became a favorite photography spot for soldiers after the capture before it was destroyed. Well, little did he know that when he was roommates with Mark Payne at West Point in the late 1990s, that they would be in the same unit, Mark being a battle captain for Colonel Hickey in the 1st Brigade, relaying information back to the headquarters from the field. Little did they realize that as they were roommates at West Point and classmates, that they would be on the same raid in the same historic event in a moment of history. Returning to Iraq about 15 months after we got home from the first tour, now each of these individuals were in charge of their own commands, each in charge of a company-sized infantry force. Ian was killed in action while leading his troops in battle on a raid in April of 2006. Left behind a young wife and an 18-month-old child who was born while he was deployed on the first tour. So those of us that knew Ian, we went to Arlington National Cemetery to pay our respects to a fallen friend. If you haven't been to Arlington, it's laid out in sections now of the recent wars. You have the older sections, and then you've got World War II, Vietnam. You have others. But the Iraq and Afghanistan fallen section is pretty much just those guys and gals. And as they lay them out, they go down a row, and then when they get to the end, just burying them as they receive them, they start the next row and weave it back, and then just make the row down perfect manicured lawns as they put up the markers. And so we laid Ian to rest. 6 months later, while ignoring the concussion from a roadside bomb, Mark Payne led his troops on a raid in which he was killed by enemy gunfire. And so those of us that knew Mark, we went to Arlington to pay our respects to yet another fallen friend. And as we followed the caisson out to the location, to the cemetery, we noticed that the spot where Mark was laid was at the feet of Ian Weichel, where they were roommates at West Point, brothers in battle, and now companions forever. After the burial, I went to our nation's capital trying to process a great many things. I was waiting for a flight to go out the next morning. So I wandered around our capital in the fall of 2006 in the melancholy air that hung everywhere. Trying to process the loss of friends, trying to process the sacrifices that we had made in this war, and an ungrateful nation at home castigating us and nitpicking our reason for being there and saying that the war was immoral and that our president was a war criminal and that you had Senate leaders declaring the war was lost. And you had politicians on both sides of the aisle saying we had no business being there. Tough stuff to take as a soldier who has fought there and had great success there and lost friends. And so I began to wander around the Capitol Mall, looking at the monuments that represented the greatness of our country. And then I found myself drawn to a very ornate, Gothic-looking building, and it was the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. And as I walked in, drawn to the central exhibit, I was struck by this, the Wright Flyer, the world's first airplane. Amazing to see it in person. As I walked around the rotunda where it was displayed, I read how they made it. And I was struck by all of the naysayers that said it would never fly. Looking at it, it's hard to imagine it ever did, or that someone could risk life and limb getting it into the air. But at that time, there was all of these people that stood in the way of this life-changing achievement. And as I left outside the rotunda, I walked outside, and hanging in the gallery above me, you saw the bold title, Spirit of St. Louis, blazoned on the cowl of a sturdier-looking craft. And what struck me about this one is that it had no forward-looking window in the cockpit, just a forward-looking pilot at the controls. Rounding the corner to, well, at the time, though, you go back and read the headlines from 1927, and there they are again, the naysayers and the cynics saying, you're never going to get off the ground with the weight of all of that gasoline. You're never going to cross the Atlantic Ocean alone. You will never stay awake. You're going to die, you fool, like all of the others. Far more experienced pilots, aces from World War I or the World War, they've not been able to achieve it. What makes you think that you can? What are you thinking? Those were the types of counsel that the pilot received. And as I rounded the corner to examine spacecraft, I marveled at, to me, what looked like aluminum foil and wondered how a substance so thin could sustain life in outer space. How was it that we, in this country, found Americans foolish enough to believe that you could strap yourself onto a rocket containing 2,000 metric tons of fuel that by design would explode on the launch pad and throw you into space, and because of someone's mathematical calculation and theories of gravity, it would hurl you towards the moon. And once you got out there, that the rocket would break apart by design and it would leave two sections left. And once you got to the moon, these two sections would break apart, be able to meet one another, be able to lock and seal, and astronauts would climb through it, get into this, separate without anybody dying, and then land on the moon, right itself, get out, plant a flag, collect a few rocks, get back in, pop back up, and then the expanse and the size of the moon, you would find the other craft who would still be there. And then when you found it, you would be able to dock back with it, lock and seal it, climb back in, and because of someone's theory of gravity, that you could go around the moon and slingshot back towards the earth because of someone's theory of gravity, hurling at thousands of miles an hour. And don't worry, you'll slow down when you hit that fiery atmosphere of the earth. but we'll put little asbestos plates on the bottom, and it will protect you. And as you come sailing through at hundreds of miles an hour in this capsule, parachutes will deploy, and you'll land in the Pacific Ocean, and a helicopter is going to come and find you and get you out. And yet that's exactly what we in this country did. But to read the reports at the time, there they are again, the naysayers, the cynics, the critics, saying, what about the war on poverty? What about the domestic problems that we are facing here at home? Why should we be wasting billions of dollars on things that are frivolous in this endless pursuit and race with the Russians? We ought to be focusing on our domestic issues here at home. Remember the arguments? They were there, the cynic and the critic. But as I pondered the achievements of Americans in the National Air and Space Museum, after hearing all the melancholy predictions about our war and that the war is lost and we shouldn't support the surge and we should leave, that we had no business being in Iraq, I left the National Air and Space Museum and re-entered the gloomy mood outside, and I left inspired, because it dawned on me that America has never been built on the labor and counsel of the cynic and the critic. Cynics and critics, soldiers of this generation, have had a belly full of them. Every single monumental mission our nation has asked its men and women in uniform to do has been accomplished. Overthrow the Taliban, done. Kill or capture Osama bin Laden, dead. Overthrow Saddam's regime and defeat his army, done. Kill or capture Saddam Hussein and bring him to justice, done, tried, and hung. And all of it in 8 years. And we have the gall as Americans to say, what are we doing? And why is it taking so long? Really? Our soldiers have done these achievements with the prattle and obstructionists of cynics and critics telling us that it was all some big mistake. Nonsense. What can we learn from today's generation of warriors, guys like these that will come home? What can we learn from them in this current war? Perhaps this: there are still things worth fighting for in the United States of America. How sad that they should defend on foreign shores only to come home and see it lost to cynics and critics at home saying, what the heck? Our nation's going to pot and we can't do anything about it. How sad that we would give up our lives, our blood, and our treasure to defend these shores only to see it lost by quitters at home. There are still Americans that know how to sacrifice. How do I know? Because I see them all the time as I speak in cities all across the United States. I've spoken in over 30 cities this year so far. I'll be heading to Brandon, Mississippi this coming week. And there are still Americans that get it, that know the difference between who is a threat and who is harmless. Whether to quit or stick to what we know and defend our faith, defend our freedoms, and protect our families. And thank God America still has men and women such as you today who know this as well. But America needs to learn to sacrifice along with her warriors. The veterans have never quit doing this, and they'll identify with it. But we need to sacrifice a few of these things here at home. We need to sacrifice doubt, sacrifice anxiety, and sacrifice cynicism. Sacrifice any notion that causes us to come home from this war as losers. You see, it won't be enough to just put up the names of our friends on slabs of marble in pretty gardens in Washington, D.C. and call it a day. That's important. That's remembering. But that's not enough. If we truly want to honor people like Ian Weichel and Mark Payne, the true heroes of every war, those that never got to come home and live in the freedoms that they sacrificed for, who never knew the joys of marriage, who never got to see their children raised or live to see their grandchildren, then we have to honor it with our commitment and our hard work about what is true here at home. And that includes our faith. As visionary as we think we are, and as much as we think we love our country and our God, we will make little headway in this country if our only answers are mere sideline snipes about what's wrong with the United States of America. Our task is to show the American people what's right with the United States of America. Ignore the cynics and get to work. But I also tell you, from someone who has served both in uniform and has served as a lawmaker in the political system, government cannot save you. And if you're putting your hopes that it can, you're going to be sorely disappointed. What's the most patriotic thing you can do today? Stay married. What's the most important thing that you can do for your God? Pass your faith on to the next generation of your children. If we just did those tasks, God will have a mighty force to use and not be done with this country at all. But you see, He doesn't need the United States of America to accomplish His purposes. He will go to those whom He can use. You want to know why China is being blessed economically? Because China is growing by the millions in Christian faith. Did you ever think for a moment He might be able to use Chinese believers to bring others to accomplish His purpose in Jesus Christ? And how terrible would that be? You see, it's not what we achieve. It's not some trophies that we gain or medals that we wear or some notoriety that we might find that matters. The only thing that really matters is that we love the Lord with all of our hearts, with all of our souls, and all of our strength, and that we follow after Him as followers in Jesus Christ, and not be tangled with the things that don't matter. And while we have the assurance of the prayer of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in the garden, He prayed for us in advance. He said, Father, I pray that you take them not out of the world, for they are in the world, but I pray that you would protect them from the evil one. Now think on that for a moment. Do you think God is going to hear the prayer of His Son Jesus Christ asking to protect you from evil in the coming days? That's a prayer that's going to be answered. And every time that you feel under assault or under fire from evil influence in your life, or make poor decisions in any given day in this fleshly bodies that we have as sinners, guess what? For every evil influence out there telling you to do wrong, there are two angels that did not rebel against God that are there for you to call on. And I like those numbers as an instrument. 2-to-1 odds are pretty good. As if we needed them at any rate, because our hope and salvation is secured already in Jesus Christ. I want to encourage you this morning, don't despair for our nation. Christ never tried to establish His kingdom by altering political power in Rome. It never happened. He also didn't tell the Roman centurion, have you thought about becoming a preacher? He told him, I've not seen faith this strong ever. Go your way. And so I want to encourage you this morning. Don't quit. Keep the faith. And as you have the naysayers that are constantly telling you, the cynics and the critics, that your endeavors or your beliefs are never going to fly, face the wind and ignore their cries and keep up the good fight. God bless you all. Thanks for letting me share with you here this morning. And if you do not know Jesus Christ, make it right this morning. God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you again, Senator Russell. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Father, we come now to a moment of benediction, which we have been challenged first and foremost by the call to right our heart with you. Lord, may we respond in obedience to live out our faith in your kingdom. As we prayed a little bit ago, your kingdom come, your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven. Again, Lord, we thank you for men and women who have served faithfully to our country. But I pray, Lord, that you would challenge all of us to accept the call to the commitment to walk in faith with you. And now, Lord, as we go from this place, may we go full of your grace, full of your peace, full of your love, to bring about your kingdom into our world. In Christ's holy name I pray. Amen. Again, I encourage you to be a part of